Argentina has made it to both the 2019 and 2023 World Cup. To understand just how big of a success that is in itself, we have to go back about 10 years. Did you know that back then the national team was listed by FIFA as inactive? Their federation AFA wasn't keen to invest basically anything in their women's side. And not only the national team was underinvested, players in the Argentinian league earned so little that in 2019 a player actually decided to sue her club. She won and the Argentinian league became professional. Hosted by Verena. Because women's football matters. To talk about these developments and more, I was joined by journalist Melanie Anzidei, who's currently a writer for The Athletic. And for The Athletic, she went to her first ever World Cup last year to cover it in beautiful Australia and New Zealand. So I asked her, so what was it like when you went to the World Cup? What was that experience like for you?
It was definitely, like, the obvious is it was a once in a lifetime experience. It was an opportunity that kind of came up pretty last minute, so I jumped on it. And I don't know, it was just so eye-opening to see. It was my first time at a World Cup period, but it was also the ability to see it on the women's side and to see the excitement and the growth. It felt like you were witnessing history kind of happening at the same time as some pretty amazing football matches.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you get to see Argentina as well?
Unfortunately, I did not. I was based in Sydney the whole time of the duration of the tournament. So I was hoping if they had advanced out of groups that eventually they'd come to Australia, but unfortunately that didn't happen. I did have coworkers, who were covering the U.S. who did get to catch, if not an Argentinian match, they did get to catch the excitement from the fans. So that was kind of that was talked about in our Slack channels, just about how passionate and how enthusiastic the fans were, which was pretty exciting to hear.
Yeah, unfortunately they didn't do as well. They only got 1 point and were knocked out in the group stages. How would you say the World Cup went for them? How would you kind of review that?
I mean, it's vastly different for the women's side as it is for the men's. The men's side does compete to win the World Cup. That's their goal. Anything less would be considered potentially a failure. For the women's side, they were fighting to win one match. Like, they've never won a match in a World Cup. So coming home with 3 points would have been a really big deal for them. And I remember watching the press conferences with their coach, who was saying things like, we'll learn from this. And it is very much in a state of development. And I feel with the competition on the world stage as high as it is, the women's side can only go up from here. And, their final game was against Sweden. So, that the team that kind of went on to take out the U.S. So it's not, I think they are better for the competition. And I think I'm very excited to see how they do the Gold Cup for the first time in their debut of that tournament.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that as well, because it's kind of a new tournament and it features countries from both Americas or across the continents. What do you think the chances Argentina has in that are?
I feel like they have a good chance of getting pretty far, if not. I just feel like they're on a high still from the World Cup, I think that's still relatively recent. And I mean, just watching, for example, like Sophia Braun, she went from playing in college to playing in Liga MX, and now she's playing in the NWSL soon for Kansas City Current. So it's exciting watching, and it's not just Sophia. Like, I feel like every woman athlete from the World Cup has kind of advanced in their career in the past several months since the tournament ended. There's just so many examples across all of the different leagues and countries. I mean, so I feel like they're still riding that momentum. So I'm very excited to see what they do with that. and as well, you can say all the teams are kind of riding on that wave as well. But I think Argentina, especially because there is like that rivalry with Argentina Mexico historically on the men's side. So I'm curious if that will translate, in the passion of the game that we'll see tonight and in that matchup.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you might have guessed when you listen to this, we're recording on the on the day before the match, which will have taken
Yeah.
place. So if you're listening to this, you will probably know more than we do right now. But I mean, to take this a bit into perspective, Argentina is a team that just like 10 years ago was listed by FIFA as not even being active. So it's quite astonishing how far they've come. Can you maybe talk to me a bit about that time back when Argentina was still, well, the federation wasn't really giving them any money and they weren't really investing in them, and yeah, what was that like for the players back then?
Yeah. So it's it's a long story, but like historically, and it's not, what you see just across the board, unfortunately, with a lot of these federations, they don't invest nearly the same, or if anything, on the women's side. And AFA was no different. There was the very specific example that players had to speak up, about they had to speak up in the same way that you see the U.S. women's national team having to speak up for equal pay. You see like a version of that across different teams, but in Argentina specifically, it was kind of similar, where you had to have players speak up and demand change for it to finally happen. Um, it's also notable that the Federation in Argentina was going through a lot on just in general. FIFA had to come in and intervene and to help them get things in order. And when you have Chiquitapia coming in, and in 2017 you start seeing a lot of change, that just coincided with the women. There were lawsuits, there was Instagram posts, there was a lot of backlash and push for better resources, because they want to be treated as professionals. And then you kind of started seeing those things happen. And once you start seeing those things happen, it translates to more attention, specifically with the media. One thing that fascinated me the most before the tournament was where you finally had, like, for the first time, like a press tour, like a press conference with players, where the Argentine press was very invested in telling their stories, which is something that you just hadn't seen before. So there were just so many different ways where the women's side of the game started growing in terms of actual resources, just even being recognized as, professional soccer players and getting paid for it. And that culturally translates to, everyone's dream is playing in a World Cup if you're a professional soccer player. And so it those investments and that kinds of resources allowed for it to kind of finally become a reality in a way that they could actually start to compete in a more meaningful way on the pitch.
Let's talk a bit about what happened in 2017. So in 2017, they were playing or active again, and they went on a strike. Can you go a bit more in detail on what these things they wanted were and whether they got them or not?
Yeah, so I remember vividly around that time how you see mixed reports about little things, like where they wouldn't even be given stipends, or the amount of stipends they were, I remember hearing like $18 a day, or they were fighting for something so bare minimum as that. So, you see players go on strike, and that kind of, and eventually, I think you see the strike, but as it wasn't until the lawsuit that happened.
Do you mean
Yeah,
the
so
league lawsuit?
yeah, so in 2019, that February, when Macarena Sanchez, she sued her club. So that's kind of all happening at the same time. And where you have players, you have these protests happening, but also you have a case where there's a legal fight happening. And I feel like that legal fight kind of pushed it to the edge, where you finally did have some meaningful change because of that. So it wasn't just there was a strike people were complaining. There was more awareness about the unpaid stipends, poor training conditions, poor travel arrangements. And, unfortunately, that's something that you can probably see that same story happening in so many different federations and countries, especially around that time in 2017. But then it wasn't until 2019 where you do have that lawsuit where you finally start seeing changed. And, that's when there's like that famous press conference with AFA granting that professional status for the top division of women's football. And that's kind of where you finally start seeing this evolution of the game in a more meaningful, concrete way, where you do have the professionalism of the sport.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you have to keep in mind that a lot of them play in the Argentinian league as well. So yeah, it's very important that that is professional as well. And then they actually do make it to the World Cup in 2019. But there was a bit of turmoil after that because, well, some of the players were still very outspoken about the things that weren't going right. And Estefania Bernini, she was one of the ones excluded then. Do you know a bit about why that was or what kind of happened to her?
Yeah, definitely. So she famously spoke up on Instagram, and she was very vocal about, they need more resources. They want to be coached. They want to be taken seriously because they deserve that. And also, that's the only way that you will see meaningful changes in terms of on the pitch, if you have the resources and the coaching staff needed to kind of grow as a team, as a footballer. And when she does that, she notably is not seen on rosters, on call-ups, on things like that. So that was kind of, it's like a stain on the history of the sport, because she did captain the team in 2019 during the World Cup. And, she's probably one of the players that everyone was paying attention to in 2023, this past summer for the World Cup. And I remember towards the end of the tournament, she was visibly distraught at the end of it, because, this is to be seen. You never know if the one World Cup is going to be your last World Cup. So yeah, so she was left off the roster, but it wasn't until there was a new coaching change where she was, brought back onto the fold of the team. And that was when Herman Portanova took over. And, he's now leading the team into this Gold Cup tournament this month.
And of course, he also was in charge at the World Cup in 2023. Do you remember kind of what impression he gave off, and whether he seemed, well, maybe a bit more serious about the sport than the former coaches?
For sure. I will say, I can just speak to what I remember from the like watching the press conferences. I wasn't there in person, but I tried to watch them virtually as much as I could. And I do remember he spoke very, he was very realistic about the expectations, and also very aware of the realities of that this is going to take time, that the team is in a developmental phase, which is what you want to hear from a coach, because it sounds like he's invested in the game long term, on the team long term, because he does say, we're going to take everything that we learned from this tournament to help grow the game. And he did speak to, how this would help grow the game back home in Argentina too.
Going back maybe to the Gold Cup now, do you think it's a good step? Because of course before there was always the Copa America, or the female version of that. Do you think it's a good step to kind of merge the two competitions now?
I think the thing that is most important, unfortunately, for football on the women's side, is that you kind of have to get change, you kind of have to win games, and you kind of have to get more awareness and more visibility. And I do think the Gold Cup offers the Argentinian national team a chance to kind of grab people's attention right now. And also there's an interesting, it's interesting to see what happens in terms of, Argentinian football is growing so much in the United States on the men's side, with Lionel Messi and Inter Miami, and also often investing in, their own facilities in Florida to grow the game and to kind of specifically target that, like the American Argentinian nationals, people with the mixed heritage who would potentially qualify for playing for Argentina, but might be in the United States. So it's interesting to see how having the team play in a Gold Cup tournament that is, based, CONCACAF, United States, um, it will be interesting to see what kind of growth and what kind of things come from this tournament. I'm very, very interested in seeing what happens at the end of this in terms of what avenues the national team has to grow, whether that's more competitions in the U.S., linking with the men's side potentially, and seeing where they have shared interests in trying to grow the games in the United States. If this peaks, if they do win, unfortunately, I mean, the famous example is the United States women's national team. They had to win a World Cup to kind of get equal pay. So you have to win games to kind of, unfortunately, on the women's side, to get the attention and to be taken seriously. So I'm very excited to see what happens with this tournament.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, they did do a big step by qualifying to the two World Cups now. And as you mentioned in the beginning, there was quite a few Argentinian fans who made it all the way to Australia and New Zealand. Do you think the attention is already grabbed, or what do you think are the next step to get even more people hooked on it?
I think it's so important, and it says so much that Argentinian fans are paying attention to this team. My family is Argentinian. My father came to the United States in the 70s with my mother. And so when I talk about the women's national team, a few years ago even, they'd be like, oh, I didn't know they were playing. But now, just they do know that they are playing. They're more invested. They're more interested in watching the team, even with the time difference with New Zealand. Argentinian fans were paying attention. Little things like the Argentinian media is tweeting. There's so much social media buzz about the champions of the World Cup, the men's national team, and now you see there's a lot of crossover with the hype of the men's team, supporting the women's side too. And all of this is something that a couple years ago you wouldn't have seen, and it's so important, I think, because it speaks to that cultural shift that has to happen for the game to be taken seriously. That hasn't happened before, unfortunately, on the women's side, even though, Argentina is such a soccer crazy country. So for me, it's hopeful to see that there is more attention, more interest just from like the average fan to kind of pay attention to the women's side. And, also it's great soccer to watch, so why not pay attention?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, they have definitely taken big steps, and there's a lot of potential there. But there's also, as I already said, a lot of players still playing in Argentina, a league that's at least not given the attention it probably deserves. Do you think it would be a good step for some of the players to go abroad? Like, I mean, of course, there are some who go to play college soccer in the US or who go to Europe. Do you think these are good options, or is it more important to grow the domestic league?
I think you need to provide opportunities for, young girls to play the game. I think that's important, because then they can make it up the ranks to play professionally, whether that's domestically or abroad. I do think it's important to grow the domestic avenues for girls to play. One could argue that the Argentinian, just for both men and women, can do a lot to improve the leagues domestically. And I just hope that if, when we talk about it on the men's side, we're also considering what the women's side looks like as well. I do think there is value in having players play abroad. Liga MX interests me so much because you had so many players who were shining in the World Cup who either played there or started there. And then, you have the NWSL attracting so many foreign players. I think it's important that Argentinian players kind of keep up with the globalization of the game. So there is value in having someone play abroad and then come back, and because the sport is just unfortunately more structured in other parts of the world as it is in the Argentina. Um, so I do think it's important for it to grow domestically, just because you need to have like the bottom up, like the youth potential to grow on the girl side to get girls interested to kind of continue playing. And it's so interesting because in Argentina, just on the youth side, girls were kind of pushed away from playing soccer. You know, famously, like, I think volleyball was the biggest sport that girls would be pushed to play, you know, and soccer wasn't what women were kind of pushed towards. It was a men's game. It was the boys' game. It wasn't what girls used to do. But now I think that's changing, and I think that's a very basic step that needs to have the resources to continue that growth.
That actually brings me to two of the questions we try to ask every guest we have on at the end. So, because you already mentioned that you play yourself, but what is it that originally got you into women's soccer or soccer in general?
I always say I'm obviously Argentinian, so it's just, you know, football has been just a part of my life for as long as I can remember. You know, when the World Cup was in the United States, where I'm based, in '94, my family, I always joke with my mother. I'm like, why didn't you take me to the World Cup in 1994 when Maradona was playing? She's like, you were 3 years old. What were you going to do there? You were just going to annoy me. So I was left home with with the other young kids in my family. But you know, it's just always been a part of my life. Like watching my family's River Plate fans, so you know, watching them on Sundays, it's just always I've just always been around it. So of course, when I was 3 years old and I could play a sport, I started playing soccer, and that was just kind of where I found joy in playing a sport. So I played all the way through rec soccer, travel, club, college. I still play on co-ed leagues. Um, it's just always been a part of my life. But I always say if it wasn't for my Argentinian heritage, you know, the love of the game was kind of in, you know, it's in your blood if you're Argentinian. But I was lucky enough where I was raised in the United States, where we fortunately have the resources available, or I had the opportunity to play the sport in a way that I don't know if I would have had if I was raised in Argentina. So I'm grateful for both of my, you know, Argentinian and American sides for that.
That's a great answer. And the second question is because I mean, there's obviously a lot of talk about how the women's game and the men's game are kind of different from each other, and how the women's game is supposed to grow, but then also there's this idea that it should still remain kind of this special thing that it is, and a bit unique, and not just try to become the same as men's soccer. Do you agree with that, or how do you see that development? How do you view that, if you know what I mean? I think I worded it a bit weirdly, but
do you mean on the actual game itself on the pitch, or just the way that
everything.
It's kind of a business now?
Yes, more the business part probably.
I think it's so funny because even outside of like football, women's sports in general, to be a female athlete, you're always just grateful for the opportunity. So instead of actually demanding like equal pay, equal resources, equal airtime, even. So I think it is important, and there is so much value in there being the business side of the sport. I don't think that'll take away from the joy of it. What comes to mind is kind of the argument about whether college athletes in the United States should be paid or not. They think that if you pay an athlete, it'll take away the joy. I don't think it will affect the game in a bad way. I think it's about time that women's athletes are taken seriously and get the necessary pay, equal pay, and resources to kind of thrive. And I also think tactically, like on the pitch itself, the game is more aggressive, it's more tactical. It's inevitable that there's going to be more investment on the business side. And I'm very excited for that, to see how that helps, in turn grow the sport and make the games better too.
How did you view that when you were at the World Cup? I mean, I don't know how much you followed the previous World Cups, maybe, or if that was kind of the first one you were actively following, but did you, I don't know, could you feel how the level had gone up?
Certainly. I mean, there's just so much more attention. I mean, if you look at the viewerships, the social media buzz, like, there was just so much more attention on the tournament in a way that I can't think of another tournament that was this exciting, And, the United States didn't make it as far as many people expected, but that was kind of, for the global game, probably a good thing, because it gave so many more people an opportunity, or so many more countries and federations and athletes a chance to kind of step into those primetime matches that was kind of designed for the US to kind of have that light shown onto them, because they are, they do bring it so much more attention to the game, and they are one of the most dominant teams in the world. So to have that, I would have loved to see the US women's national team make it all the way, but their absence allowed for other people to kind of step in, which was great. And I do think the attention on the sport is just so much greater. And even just, I hadn't covered another World Cup previously. This was my first time covering a World Cup, but I do hear anecdotally from some of my colleagues how this was the most reporters who were there. Just the amount of attention on the media side is huge, and that translates to everything else, because when you have more visibility on the game. So I do think the investment I don't think there's been anything like it. And it is the World Cup, but it's also just women's sports in general. I just think the attention right now is profound, and I think it's going to be exciting to see, what the 2027 tournament is going to be like. I think it's going to be huge. I think it's going to be the biggest ever, and I feel like we're going to be saying that after every single tournament, from here on out.
I hope so.
I hope so. I think so.
Yeah,
there's money
too.
to be made, for sure, so people will invest.
Yeah, people are starting to realize that, finally.
Yeah, finally, for sure.
That was my conversation with Melanie. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find Melanie on Twitter and Instagram at Melanie Anzidei. You can find Women's Football Collective on YouTube, Instagram and TikTok at WF_collective, and our website is wfcollective.com. Global is produced by Yannis Müller and hosted by Verena Müller-Baltes. If you follow us on Instagram, you probably know which country the next episode on April 10th will be about. And if you don't and you want to know, well, follow us on Instagram. Until next time.